As most of you have already been familiar with CCP-NTH, and for those who are the first time to join our event, I give a brief introduction to the CCP-NTH. CCP-NTH stands for the Collaborative Computational Project in Nuclear Thermohydraulics. It was founded by EPSRC since 2020. It's one of the UK CCP projects supported by COSAC UKRI. CCP-NTH aims to develop a strong collaborative community and maintain and develop computational methods and software packages to modernize the nuclear thermohydraulics tools. This special topic seminar is a series of seminars, each one focused on a special topic. For today's seminar, the topic is multi-phase flow and boiling. Our first speaker is Yohei Sato from Scherrer Institute. Yohei received his PhD degree from the University of Tokyo in 2006. Since 2009, he has been working at Scherrer Institute in Switzerland as a scientist. His major research fields is computational fluid dynamics, especially for free surface flows and phase change phenomenon. Today, he will talk about progress in boiling flow simulation using interface resolving scheme. Yohei, you can share your screen.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to this seminar. So today's topic I want to talk is I think you can see my screen, the full screen, I hope. So today's topic is the progress of boiling flow simulation using interface resolving scheme. And I belong to Scherrer Institute, and today I just want to show one project in CFD group in PSI, Scherrer Institute. And especially today, I want to talk about the interface resolving scheme. This is illustrated on the left side. And sometimes it is called single fluid model. And the right one is the phase average scheme or two fluid model, or sometimes it is called Eulerian model. And the left one and the right one is completely different. And the left one is usually people use the VOF method or level set method. And in this method, only single couple of Navier-Stokes equation is solved. And the feature is the interface is resolved. On the other hand, the right hand, two fluid modeling, the interface is not explicitly captured. So today's topic is the left one. And to simulate the boiling flow and the heat transfer on us from the heat transfer surface, we need a lot of modeling. So first, we need to take into account the conjugate heat transfer between solid and fluid. And then on the heat transfer surface, there are nucleation sites. And from nucleation sites, the vaporization starts. And the bubbles are formulated. And the bubbles are merged or collapse. And if the heat flux becomes higher, dry spot appears. So we need, and also there's a natural circulation or convective flow. We need to simulate all these phenomena. And the history of our code, CFD code, is the name is PSI boil. It's not so special, but it's an incompressible flow. And we are using finite volume method and Cartesian grid using a staggered variable arrangement, and it's now open source code. And this approach is quite, let's say, traditional approach. And we add many modelings required for interface tracking. The second one is surface tension modeling. And also we developed phase change model, and we also developed micro layer model. And the micro layer is a thin liquid film which exists underneath the wall, underneath the growing bubble, but on the surface. And to capture this micro layer liquid thin film, we have also developed the modeling for this. And of course, we need the multiple nucleation site model. So I want to show the last one, how we simulate the nucleate boiling. On the text, it is written like this, the top figures. There is a cavity on the wall, and from the cavity, the bubble starts to grow. And finally, the bubble detaches from the wall. And this is on the textbook. And in our simulation, we do like this. First, we prescribe the nucleation site on the wall, this point. And if the temperature on this point reaches active nucleation temperature, then we put small bubble in the liquid phase, in the fluid domain, and then it starts to grow. And this is how we treat the nucleate boiling. So this is just a validation for single nucleation site boiling flow. And this is an experiment of MIT. So, and here I show the bubble growth from the nucleation site. And the middle figure shows the temperature on the wall. And the right one is a side view of the growing bubble. And it grows and it detaches from the heat transfer surface. And this is a pool boiling simulation. And as you can see, we can capture very good with high resolution. And this is a comparison of the experiment against the experiment. The top figure is the side view of the bubble shape, and the simulation result is the third row, and it agrees quite well. And the second row of this figure is the IR image. This is a temperature field on the heat transfer surface, looking from the bottom. And the bottom line row corresponds to the experiment, but this is a CFD result, and it agrees quite well. And the more quantitative comparison is given here. The left side is temperature on the heat transfer surface. And the 0 is the nucleation site. And you can see many lines, but for example, this blue line is the temperature at the initiation of the nucleate boiling. From here, suddenly the temperature drops to the red line, and then it becomes green line. And here you can see this curve, and this curve indicates that there is a dry out from the center to this the bottom, and then outside there is a micro layer, and then it becomes black line, and finally it detaches from the bottom. And in the simulation, this is a result of the simulation. Right side, basically we can capture the growing of this dry patch, but basically it agrees well, but still the curve shape is not perfect. And I want to show the nucleation site model if there are not single nucleation site. So first, what we need is the right figure. We need the number of nucleation activation sites. Let's say this is a nucleation site density as a function of wall temperature. And in the simulation, I use a random number to put the first nucleation site location. So this location, blue one, is given by random number, but the nucleation activation temperature for this point is given by the right figure. The first one is given, for example, 107 degrees. And the second one is, again, I use random number and I give the nucleation temperature, activation temperature from the right figure, for example, 108. And I repeat this process. And finally, I define the multiple nucleation sites. And each nucleation site has the activation temperature, unique activation temperature for that point. And today I want to show two examples of the simulations. The first one is DNB of saturated pool boiling, and the second one is the DNB of subcooled convective boiling. So the first case is the Gartner's experiment. This is quite old experiment, but what is good for me or for us is Gartner measured the figure middle one. So this is an active nucleation site density as a function of temperature. And using this line, I can reproduce the nucleation sites in the simulation. And this is a computational domain, and it's not so big, just 4 centimeter cube. And the copper block is located at the center and the bottom of this computational domain, and the thickness is 6 millimeter and the diameter is 20 millimeter. And the heat flux is applied from the bottom of this copper block. So it's very similar to the experimental setup. And what I use, the grid spacing is around 100 micrometer. So first I want to see a little bit lower heat flux. And the applied heat flux is now 100 kilowatts per square meter. And in this case, the temperature of the copper block is not so high, and only, let's say, 10 nucleation sites are activated. And as you can see, the bubbles are quite isolated. And here you can see the color, brown color, represent the temperature of the fluid. Basically, yeah, what you can see here is a superheat of the liquid and also vapor phase. And this is, of course, a transient simulation, and I need to simulate or calculate this simulation until I can get the periodic or cyclic conditions. And now I increase the heat flux to 800 kilowatts per square meter. And now in this case, the heat flux is quite higher. And as you can see, let's say at the bottom, the nucleation sites are continuously activated. And also the bubbles are created and the rose and departs so quickly. And as you can see, the big mushroom bubble is generated. And actually, in this case, 1,200, this is a critical heat flux condition. And now, The left figure is again the temperature field, and the right figure, this is the color here on the right side shows the thickness of liquid film. And the white area on the right hand side, it's the dry spot. And the red one shows a very, very thin liquid film on the wall. And at critical heat condition, this white region, the dry spot, tries to increase, but it cannot continue to increase the area because it is re-wetted, and then once it is re-wetted, and then it dries out, and this continues. But in case of larger heat flux, 1,500 kilowatt, and then what we can see is the film boiling. So again, the right side, the color indicates the liquid film thickness. And as you can see, once this heat transfer surface is covered with the dry spot, or let's say dry out, but it is re-wetted when this large bubble detaches from the wall. And the temperature continues to increase, and finally, the heat transfer surface is fully dry out, and then it reaches a film boiling. And this is a comparison of the experiment of heat transfer coefficient between experiment and the CFD. And the CFD is this blue line, and this red one is measured one by Gartner. And at least we can detect the peak critical heat flux using this approach. But to simulate this kind of condition, we really need a strong computational power. And I used a supercomputer in Switzerland. And using post-processing, I can partition the heat flux into 3 parts: single phase liquid, and also microlayer, and single phase vapor. And as you can see, this ratio changes as a function of applied heat flux. And at the critical heat flux condition, 1,200, this ratio is almost 50% single phase and 50% at microlayer. And we can use this kind of result for the 2 fluid simulations, to develop the modeling of 2 fluid models. So next one is a DNB of subcooled convective boiling. And the case I selected is the Cosmos L experiment at KIT, Scherrer Institute of Technology. And yeah, in the experiment, it's a really double cylinder, but in the CFD, I use this kind of rectangular computational grid because of a limitation of CFD software. And the system pressure is 2 bar. It's not so high like a power plant, but at least higher than the atmospheric pressure. And the boundary condition is like this. The saturation temperature is 120 degrees, but the inlet liquid temperature is 80 degrees. That is 40 degrees lower than the saturation temperature. And for this experiment, we don't know the nucleation site density. So I used a correlation from Ishii. And for this one, I need a turbulence model because flow becomes turbulence, and I cannot do DNS simulation. So I use LES, smuggling scheme modeling. And this is a result of 375. This is a CHF multiplied 30%. In this case, still the bubble is, there are not so many bubbles. The figure shows that left bottom is the inlet and the right top is the outlet. And the color shows basically the wall temperature. And this figure, the middle figure, shows the comparison between experiment and the comparison of wall temperature between simulation and measurement. The vertical axis is height and horizontal axis is wall superheat. And we can get very good result. And the next one shows the simulation at critical heat flux. So again, the flow is from the left bottom to the right top. And actually the temperature continues to increase at the point Subcooled 18. Subcooled 18 is here at the on this line. And actually the temperature of downstream here 16 or 14 or 12 is lower than 18 because of the velocity of the fluid. I mean, the velocity of fluid at 16 or 14 or 12 is higher than the 18. And finally, the temperature at this location becomes highest. And again, this is a comparison of wall temperature between measurement and the CFD, and I can get good result. And oh, sorry. This is again CFD result, but different point of view. And now the flow is left to right, and the top figure shows a bubble shape, and the middle one is a micro layer thickness. And here, the red color represent the basically dry out or dry spot location. And the bottom one is a temperature field. And as you can see here, the temperature continues to increase around here. It reaches like 300 degrees Celsius. And on this region, even when the heat transfer surface is re-wetted, but it immediately evaporates, and then the condition becomes dry and continues to increase the temperature. So the summary of interface resolving scheme. So simulation of DNB using interface resolving scheme is now feasible. And according to our simulation result, DNB is induced by the dry patch. And the wetting of the dry patch is insufficient to cool the hot region of the wall. And okay, let's move to the further needs and the requirement. So today I demonstrated the prediction of DNB using the interface resolving scheme, but there are still, this approach has disadvantages. It requires huge computational power, and also we need a mesh size, a very small mesh size. And I use 100 microns for 2-bar simulation. But if I want to simulate nuclear power plant condition, and then I need a mesh of 1 micron or 10 less than 10 microns cells, and I really need a huge computational power. And the CFD results is suffering from numerical bubble merge, and I need to develop or implement advanced interface tracking method to avoid this numerical bubble merge. And yeah, the interaction between the turbulence and the liquid vapor interface is still open question. And to overcome these disadvantages, I need to develop interface resolving scheme with maybe local mesh refinement. And also maybe I need some modeling to capture the temperature gradient around the interface, especially when I need to calculate subcooled boiling, because the temperature gradient is high in such a condition. And then maybe other approach could be Euler method to simulate this kind of condition. Thank you very much. And this is the end of my presentation. So please give me some feedback or comments or questions.
Thank you, Yohei. Do we have some questions? Ask directly. I have one question.
Yes, please. Yep.
Yeah, in your, the interface resolving method, what kinds of algorithm you used to reconstruct your interface?
Yep. Actually, the interface is captured as a volume fraction at 0.5. So it's a kind of a VOF method. I don't use explicit method. I don't use any grid on that interface. So each cell has a volume fraction, and this volume fraction is transported or changes due to phase change. And the interface is constructed as an isosurface of a volume fraction at 50%.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, if I may. Thank you very much for your presentation, Yohei. Very informative.
Thank you very much.
Near the start of the presentation, you talk about the specification of the nucleation sites.
Yes.
So what determines the density of the nucleation sites and the different temperature distributions that you assign to each of them? Is that something you have from experimental data, or is that tuned, or can you specify that without prior knowledge of experiment?
Yep. So when I simulate some experimental data, or when I validate, I use an nucleation site density measured in the experiment. And when I simulate a condition which I don't know the nucleation site density, I need to take such a data from literature, or let's say correlation, Ishii's correlation, or there are many correlations. And to simulate this NSD, nucleation site density, directly in CFD simulation is quite difficult, because it really depends on the surface condition. So I really need some input from experiment or correlations, or maybe molecular dynamics or some kind of solid issue. Yeah.
I figured it would be quite sensitive to the surface condition, as you said. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions?
I have one. Yes,
please.
You mentioned probably at the end that there is a modeling of the microlayer initial thickness. So in the simulation, the microlayer is resolved, because I know that that becomes very thin, and sometimes it requires also some modeling, because otherwise it's really complex to resolve entirely that very thin microlayer. So is this entirely resolved in the simulation?
Yeah, actually, I didn't show the details of the microlayer modeling, but we are using a kind of subgrid modeling. So you can see on the right figure, there is a bubble, and I define the thickness of the microlayer in a cell. And let's say the cell size is 100 microns, but the thickness of the liquid layer is 5 microns or less than 5 microns. And I define the thickness in wall adjacent cells, and this thickness becomes thinner just based on the evaporation. That means I assume that the flow in the microlayer is 0. And I just solve this, the second equation, this one. And then microlayer is thinning. And I can capture the behavior of the microlayer thinning. But actually what I need is the initial microlayer thickness. And the initial microlayer thickness, I'm using, again, the measurement data, which is coming from the Utaka's paper. And this is universal for a constant pressure and also the given pressure and material of liquid and solid phase. This combination should be determine the thickness of the initial thickness of the microlayer.
Thank you for yeah, sure. Thank you very much, and also for the presentation. Results are really impressive.
Thank you very much.
If there's time for last question, Yohei. So I wanted to thank you and Boyan as well for finding time to give your presentation. And so you mentioned that to develop your code further, you might have to go for adaptive mesh refinement. Have you already thought about a strategy there?
Actually, not yet, but we start to develop the coarse grid approaches to capture the steep temperature gradient in coarse mesh, on coarse mesh.
Okay.
But in such a case, I need some correlations or some artificial parameters.
Okay.
It's not so beautiful, but yeah, as an engineering approach, yeah, I need to use a parameter.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, I also have a question if we have a bit of time.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed it, but in the DMB cases, so the pool boiling and the convective boiling, so the heat flux that was applied is presented as a percentage of the critical heat flux. So just for my understanding, that critical heat flux, did you take it from the experimental data, or are you able to predict that critical heat flux from the results you're seeing from the bubbles?
Basically, I can, I can predict CHF from the simulation purely.
Okay.
In that case, I need to, of course, increase heat flux, applied heat flux gradually, and check if the temperature is not reaches some high temperature. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very, very interesting presentation. Thanks.